Good morning, everyone. Today's session is again a very important session, that how to handle hemato-oncology malignancy. And I think the best person from hemato-oncology who can talk about on this subject, as well as in the context of palliative medicine, I think Dr. Anupama. Before reading her CV, I really want to say that since the day I have met Dr. Anupama, I'm really impressed by her dedication and devotion to develop not only her own branch, but also to integrate palliative medicine in medical oncologist. And if we will get this kind of medical oncologist all over country, I think we have achieved our goal. So Dr. Anupama, this is coming directly from my heart, that what I have observed about you. And the people, those who are not knowing, I think most of the people they know, but those who are not knowing, she's senior consultant and head of the Department of Medical Oncology at Goa Medical College. And she has served as an honorary consultant, hematologist and medical oncologist in various several healthcare centers. She has got a lot of good academic career, that she has published 50 public papers in national and international journal. She has attended various conferences as a speaker, edited several textbooks, and she has multiple positions she has held, that is National Coordinator, National Training Program in Practical Pediatric Oncology for 2017 to 2018. She is also an editor of Pediatric Hemato-Oncology Bulletin in 2010 to 2011. She is Secretary of Pediatric. She was Secretary of Pediatric Hemato-Oncology Chapter of Indian Academy of Pediatrics for 2008 to 2009. She was Executive Board Member of Pediatric Hemato-Oncology Chapter in Indian Academy for Pediatrics from 2005 to 2007. Assistant Editor of Newsletter of Pediatric Hemato-Oncology Chapter of Indian Academy of Pediatrics for 2005 to 2007, and Executive Committee Member of Mumbai Hemato-Oncology Group in year 2005 to 2007. So you can see that at least since last almost a decade, she is working hard to develop oncology part, and especially I can see, Dr. Anupama, that you are working in a lot of work in pediatric hemato-oncology, and I have heard you, I have seen you, and you are the best person to give a justice to this topic, that how a person can integrate, oncologist can think about integrating hemato-oncology and palliative medicine together. Thank you very much for joining us. And everyone, please keep your questions in the chat box so that Arun will sort it out and take the question at the end. Thank you, Dr. Anupama.
Thank you, ma'am. Archana, can I have my slides, please? So good morning, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity. It's really an honor to be speaking on this forum, and thank you, ma'am, for a very kind introduction, and I hope I can do justice to the topic. So our topics for today are, it's not one topic, we have a whole lot of hematologic emergencies to cover, because we have 6 topics to cover. So blast crisis, hyperleukocytosis, and tumor lysis syndrome are all complications seen in leukemia. So we'll club them together. Then we have thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura and hemolytic uremic syndrome, which are 2 of the main conditions of thrombotic microangiopathy. So we will club them together. Next, please. Next slide, please.
One more, I don't know.
Okay. And then finally, next one, please. And finally, we will speak on hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis, which I will refer to as HLH. Mind you, each of these topics deserves a full lecture in itself. So I'm going to try to compress it all in the next 50 minutes. Next, please. Next slide, please. So next, please. Before we come to leukemia and blast crisis, just a very short review of what is leukemia. The bone marrow contains blood stem cells or totipotent stem cells, which then differentiate to form myeloid stem cells and lymphoid stem cells. The myeloid stem cells then go through further differentiation to form the red cells, the platelets, and the granulated cells of the blood. That is the neutrophils, the eosinophils, and the basophils. On the other hand, the lymphoid stem cell goes on to form the lymphoblast, and these then differentiate to form either the B lymphocytes, which are responsible for humoral immunity, T lymphocytes, which are responsible for cell-mediated immunity, and natural killer cells, which are the first line of defense. So whenever there is an arrest in this proliferation and differentiation, then the precursor cells start accumulating in the body, and that leads to leukemia. So if that, next one please. So if there is an arrest in the myeloid stem series, where then the myeloblasts accumulate, and you do not have further differentiation to form the mature cells, and these myeloblasts then flood out the bone marrow. They decrease the production of the red cells, the platelets, and the marrow is full with myeloblasts, which are non-functional. Similarly, next one. When there is an arrest from the lymphoblast to the further differentiation of lymphocytes, you get accumulation of lymphoblasts in the bone marrow, and the normal cells do not have any place to function, and that leads to acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Next, please. Okay, so essentially there are 4 main types of leukemia, although in each of these you have further subtypes. So acute myelogenous leukemia and acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Both can occur in children as well as in adults, but ALL is the commonest malignancy in children, contributing to approximately 40% of childhood cancers. And then the chronic myelogenous and the chronic lymphocytic leukemia is more common in adults, although we do see CML in children in the second decade of life, and sometimes even 7 and 8-year-olds we have diagnosed with CML. CLL, though, is a disease of the elderly population above 55-60 years of age. Next, please. Okay, so this is how the blasts look on the peripheral smear. The small lymphoblasts is L1, the larger is L2, the ones with vacuoles are L3, and those blasts which have a lot of cytoplasmic granules are acute myeloid leukemia. Although we don't rely on just the morphological picture anymore, and every leukemia who is diagnosed has to have a complete diagnosis with immunophenotyping. Next, please. So now we come to what is blast crisis. So blast crisis is the advanced phase of chronic myeloid leukemia, where the disease acquires additional cytogenetic abnormalities and transforms into acute leukemia. So 80% of the times it goes into a myeloid blast crisis and becomes AML. 20% of the times it develops lymphoid blast crisis. So whenever the blood or the bone marrow shows more than 20% blasts, and this may or may not be associated with anemia and thrombocytopenia, then we say that the patient of CML has progressed to blast crisis. Next, please. Okay, so this is the Philadelphia chromosome, which is the hallmark of chronic myeloid leukemia, where there is a balanced translocation from chromosome 9 and to chromosome 22. So the abridged chromosome 22 elaborates a protein called as the BCR-ABL protein. This BCR-ABL protein then, next one please, is a tyrosine kinase protein, and when it gets phosphorylated, it leads to a series of downstream activation of enzymes and proteins. They cause altered cellular adhesion, they cause activation of the mitogenic signaling, and they cause inhibition of apoptosis. All of this which lead to chronic myeloid leukemia. So patients with, next one please. Yes. So this is the natural history of chronic myeloid leukemia, that there is accumulation of immature myeloid cells, and over the years, apart from the 922 translocation, that is the Philadelphia chromosome, these cells acquire newer cytogenetic changes to progress. So the chronic phase typically lasts anywhere from 3 to 5 years, and mind you, I'm talking about natural history. So these are untreated patients, which fortunately we don't see anymore. Most of the patients who would come to medical attention would hopefully get diagnosed correctly and be treated properly. So untreated, the chronic phase would last from 3 to 5 years. It is very responsive to treatment. Some of them times, these patients are completely asymptomatic. They may go for a physical checkup, either pre-employment or insurance, and suddenly the white cell count is 2 lakhs, 1.5 lakhs, 3 lakhs, and then they are referred for further investigation, and we diagnose that they have CML, which is in the chronic phase, which has not yet become symptomatic. Or sometimes they may be symptomatic, where they come with fatigue, weight loss, left-sided abdominal pain, early satiety because of a large spleen, which is putting pressure on the stomach. And then the CBC would show a high WBC count, and we will come to the peripheral picture in the next slide. So untreated, as I said, within 3 to 5 years, they would go into the accelerated phase where they acquire more cytogenetic abnormalities. The phase of accelerated phase, the period may vary from few weeks to few months. In this period, the patients are less responsive to treatment. They develop progressive splenomegaly, myelofibrosis, and finally evolve to blast phase, which is resistant to treatment. But of course, we can always try with some chemotherapy and some targeted therapy. Next, please. Okay, so this is how the peripheral smear of patients, the first one, the peripheral smear of patients with chronic myeloid leukemia looks. So although this picture is different from acute leukemia, so in the chronic phase, they have what we call as a garden party type of picture, where you have abundant cells or in different stages of development of all the series. So you have the red cells, you have plenty of platelets, you have the few myeloblasts, 2-3%, promyelocytes, myelocytes, metamyelocytes, stab cells, and lots of neutrophils, basophils, eosinophils are seen. But when it progresses to the blast, that is when we see this kind of picture, where the blood is filled with all monomorphic cells, either myeloblasts or lymphoblasts. Next, please. Okay, so the treatment of chronic myeloid leukemia was revolutionized in the year 2000 when the first targeted therapy drug in oncology was approved by FDA for the treatment of CML, that is imatinib mesylate. It is an oral drug, which is a 400 milligram one capsule taken daily. What this drug does is it goes and binds to the ATP binding site of the BCR-ABL protein, and thereby makes this protein, the elaboration of further proteins inactive. Since these proteins are not generated, all the further downstream cascade is inhibited, and the CML clone cannot progress. This medicine has revolutionized treatment. Patients who needed hydroxyurea and could only be controlled for a couple of years with hydroxyurea can now go into complete cytogenetic remission. And since the drug was introduced in the year 2000, it's been 21 years, and we have thousands of patients all over the world who continue to take the medicine but live absolutely normal lives. They have normal blood counts, they have no splenomegaly, and nobody can even make out that this patient has a cancer and is on treatment. As of now, yes, this treatment is lifelong, but there is enough data to say that if patients have shown a very good response and they have been in complete cytogenetic remission for 5 years, we could stop that medicine, but it is under very, very close monitoring. If there is any suspicion of the leukemic clone rising, then they have to be restarted. But definitely it has been a wonder drug for patients with chronic phase. Now, patients who come in the blast crisis, next please. Okay, so if they have not been on imatinib, they would be started on imatinib, but we do get about 10 to 15% of the patients who present in blast crisis who have not been diagnosed before. If they develop the blast crisis while they have been on imatinib, then they deserve treatment with second generation tyrosine kinase inhibitors, elder brother and sister of imatinib, that is dasatinib, nilotinib. These are also very effective drugs. Dasatinib is almost 35 times more powerful, potent than imatinib. Nilotinib is 300 times more potent than imatinib. Although they do have more side effects than imatinib. Imatinib is a very well tolerated drug, hardly any side effects. Dasatinib and nilotinib do have side effects, but they can control the blast crisis of CML. However, in many times, only giving a second generation TKI is not enough, and it needs to be combined with chemotherapy. Ideally, when the patients are responding to this kind of treatment of TKIs and induction chemotherapy, if they do go into a good remission, they should be taken up for bone marrow transplant. However, not only in our country, everywhere in the world, no, hardly 20 to 30%, and in our country, probably even just 5% of the patients can actually go for bone marrow transplant. And these are the patients who will respond for few months to these TKIs and this chemotherapy, and ultimately the disease becomes unresponsive, and then they have to get good palliative care. Next, please. Okay, so that brings us to the second part of the topic, which is hyperleukocytosis. So I think we skipped a slide. Can we go one slide back, please? No, can we go one slide ahead? Next, please. Next, please. Okay, I think there is some mistake. Let's go back 2 slides. So hyperleukocytosis is basically defined as WBC count which is more than 1 lakh. That is just a working definition. When we have a WBC count which is more than 1 lakh, that causes increased viscosity of the blood, and that causes sludging of the microvasculature. This, of course, occurs in all organs, but the 2 organs which are most susceptible to the injury caused by leukostasis in hyperleukocytosis are the lungs and the brain. I think that is 1 slide which is missing, but that's fine. So these patients develop a pneumopathy because of congestion in the lungs, because the microvasculature is because of the sluggish circulation, because of the very high viscosity, because of high WBC count. Now, normally the clinical manifestations of this sludging is seen in ALL when the count is more than about 2 to 3 lakhs, whereas it is seen earlier in patients with AML where the count is more than 1 lakh. And this is because the myeloblasts, the blasts in acute myeloid leukemia, are far more stickier and they cause more sludging compared to the blasts in ALL. So these patients develop a pneumopathy where they get breathlessness, they may get hypoxic, they may develop pulmonary hemorrhage, and they can go into ARDS. The CNS manifestations include anything from confusion, obtundation, altered sensorium, to seizures, focal neurological deficits, CNS bleed, and coma with raised intracranial tension. The other organs which may be affected include the liver, and there patients may develop jaundice, transaminitis, and coagulopathy. There is sludging in the kidney circulation, which can cause acute tubular necrosis and lead to acute renal failure. In the GI, they can cause mesenteric ischemia, causing acute abdomen. They can cause priapism, and in the bones, it can lead to avascular necrosis. Next, please. Okay, this is how the slides look in hyperleukocytosis, full of white cells. Next, please. So as I said, these patients, when they come in with blast crisis, could have a past history of leukemia and could have progressed. We need to check their current medication, their present symptoms, assess them for the degree of damage already done, and then start treatment. Next, please. Okay, this is 2 short cases. I have taken 3. This was a 12-year-old boy who came with bilateral neck swellings of 15 days and had developed cough, breathlessness, and snoring for 3 days. He did not have fever, anorexia, weight loss, but he had bilateral bulky cervical lymphadenopathy, and there was no hepatosplenomegaly. This was his chest X-ray. You can see there's a large mediastinal mass, and this is the typical presentation of TALL, and it is especially seen in the 2nd decade of life. Next, please. His CBC showed that he had a WBC count of 3 lakhs. Typically in T cell, the hemoglobin is intact in the initial phase, so hemoglobin was 13, platelet count was fine. He had 82% blasts in the peripheral blood. So we sent his peripheral blood for immunophenotyping, and the diagnosis was T cell ALL. So these are when patients come with normally whenever we need to diagnose, normally when we have a patient with suspected leukemia, we always need to do a bone marrow to diagnose. But there are certain exceptions to every rule. And when patients come with hyperleukocytosis, a count of more than 1 lakh, if we can do flow cytometry on peripheral blood, we can spare the initial bone marrow. And we can always do a bone marrow a little later when the patient stabilizes. Next, please. Okay, so this was a 4-year-old boy who came with 1 week history of fever and rapidly increasing abdominal distension and lethargy. He had already received antibiotics for 5 days, following which, because the fever did not subside, CBC was done, which showed a hemoglobin of 6 grams, a WBC count of 1,25,000, and a platelet count of 60,000. This is when I got a call. I said, please transfer immediately. Next slide, please. By the time the patient arrived, another 6 to 8 hours had passed and the WBC count had gone to 3,50,000. We started on hydration, and the next morning we repeated a count, and then again in the evening, and again a repeat count, because we could not believe what we were seeing. And you can see how rapidly the WBC count has increased, and his peak WBC count was 17 lakhs. That is the highest that I have ever seen. You can also see that the platelet count is low, the hemoglobin is very low, less than 5 grams. There is increased uric acid, there is rising creatinine, rising potassium. So next, please. Okay, so we will come to this slide later as to how we started treatment. We'll go ahead. This was a 52-year-old lady who presented with fever, abdominal pain, and bruising of 1 week duration. On admission, she was very sick looking. She had fever, tachycardia, acidotic breathing. She had pallor, petechiae, ecchymosis, and massive splenomegaly. Her spleen was crossing the midline at the level of the umbilicus. Her hemoglobin was 7.5, her WBC count was 2,15,000, and platelet was low at 45,000. She had 80% blasts with or rods. So we knew she had AML, but because of the massive splenomegaly and the very high WBC count, we suspected that this was probably last crisis of CML and not just de novo AML. Next, please. So she had right-sided pneumonia, she had elevated CRP and procalcitonin. We got a flow cytometry after 24 to 48 hours, which confirmed AML, and she was started on treatment right away with hydration, antibiotics, nasal oxygen, red cell transfusion, platelet transfusion. She was stabilized over 5 to 6 days by the time we got the report of the cytogenetics and the RT-PCR, which showed that she had 100% metaphases showing Philadelphia chromosome. So that confirmed the diagnosis of CML in blast crisis with pneumonia and sepsis. When these patients are so septic and so sick, we cannot start them on chemotherapy right away, but we can definitely start them on imatinib, which we did, and the response usually, at least initially, is dramatic. Next, please. Okay, so that from hyperleukocytosis brings us to tumor lysis syndrome. So what is tumor lysis syndrome? So the blast cells contain very high amount of intracellular content of nucleotides, which get broken down to form uric acid. They have very high content of potassium and phosphate. And as the cells start lysing, once we start treatment, and sometimes even before we start treatment, there is autolysis of these blast cells, and they release all these intracellular contents into the circulation, and patients can become symptomatic because of high levels of uric acid, potassium, and phosphate. Next, please. Okay, so the nucleic acids which are released when these cells start lysing, they are broken down to form xanthine, and when xanthine oxidase converts them to uric acid. This uric acid tends to precipitate in the kidneys, causing acute kidney injury and acute renal failure. And this precipitation of uric acid is particularly so in an acidic pH. And this is important because management involves alkalinization of the patients. The phosphorus, which is released in large amounts, tends to combine with the calcium in the body, and these calcium phosphate crystals again deposit in the kidney, adding to kidney injury. And the calcium phosphate deposition occurs at a higher alkaline pH, and that is why when we manage these patients, it is very crucial to maintain their pH between 7 and 8, not acidic but not too alkaline, to prevent precipitation of uric acid and precipitation of calcium phosphate. The potassium which is released can cause hyperkalemia. Hyperkalemia, as you all know, can cause arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death. And the calcium which gets utilized in forming calcium phosphate crystals leads to a low serum calcium level, which, as you all know, hypocalcemia can cause seizures. So next, please. So basically, tumor lysis syndrome has two components, the laboratory component and the clinical component. Lab component, we say 2 or more of the following need to be satisfied, which is basically a high uric acid above 8, or a high potassium above 6, or a high phosphorus about 6.5, and a low calcium. And usually all of these may tend to be combined with a rising creatinine. So 2 out of 4 are enough to label a patient as having lab hemolysis syndrome. And clinically, it is rising, deteriorating renal function. You can have cardiac dysarrhythmias or seizures. Next, please. Okay, so how do we manage these patients with hyperleukocytosis and tumor lysis syndrome? They need very, very intense monitoring. They have to be kept in the ICU. You need very strict input-output charting, because hydration is the most important component. And then once you start hyperhydrating patients with 2 to 4 times the maintenance fluids, and can I have the next slide, please? I think we missed a slide. Yes, so we need to hydrate them with fluids which are potassium-free fluids, 2 to 4 times maintenance. We need to alkalinize their urine. Previously, we used to give bicarbs very liberally, but then if we give too much bicarb, next morning we find them in alkalotic tetany. So we've realized that if we give very good hydration, then that itself helps to alkalinize the pH, urine pH, and we tend to maintain it between 6.5 to 7.5 or 7 to 8. This patient, can we go back one slide, please? Okay, so they need strict input-output monitoring, urine pH charting. Serum electrolytes need to be measured. Electrolytes, that is potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, calcium, and creatinine and uric acid, need to be monitored. Ideally 6 hourly, but at least 2 to 3 times a day, that is 8 to 12 hourly. Because hyperkalemia can be an instant killer, we need to have all anti-hyperkalemia measures by the bedside, and some need to be started prophylactic. So we start all these patients on Kayexalate, K-bind orally to bind the potassium in the GI tract, and relatively less intensive measures like salbutamol nebulization can be started even before documenting hyperkalemia, and we need to be ready to start the patient on a glucose insulin drip once the potassium starts rising, IV calcium to counter the cardiac effects of hyperkalemia. And right from day one, the minute the patient is admitted and you realize he has hyperleukocytosis and could go into tumor lysis syndrome, you need to involve your nephrologist. You need to have emergency dialysis ready. Most of the times we are able to pull them out of this crisis with just rigorous ICU monitoring. But there have been times, especially conditions like Burkitt leukemia, which has a very high turnover, we may need to take the patient for dialysis if our measures of alkalinization, hydration do not cause the serum creatinine to be controlled, or doesn't regress, or if patient develops hyperkalemia or acidosis is uncorrected. Next, please. Okay, so what are the specific drugs that we use? There are 2 main drugs which are the backbone of our management of tumor lysis syndrome. One is allopurinol and the second is rasburicase. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll come to allopurinol and rasburicase, but one thing which I wanted to stress over here is when we have patients with hyperleukocytosis and tumor lysis syndrome, they are usually accompanied by certain other complicating situations. So as you saw in that first case, the child who had come with a large mediastinal mass. So apart from the hyperleukocytosis and TLS, they have problems with airway obstruction. So we need to have their airway management and their oxygenation. These patients can have obstruction of the superior vena cava because of the mediastinal mass, where they have congestion in the area of drainage of the superior vena cava. So we always start an IV line in the lower limb in these patients so that you can give your hydration, but you don't congest the upper part of the body, which is already congested because of SVC obstruction. These conditions are complicated with anemia and thrombocytopenia. So when you want to give hyperhydration and you already have a hemoglobin of 4 on 5 grams, then you can cause further drop in hemoglobin, and that can stress the system, and you can have patients going into congestive cardiac failure. So you need to sometimes give them Paxil transfusions, but Paxil transfusions will further increase the viscosity of blood. So it's a very fine balance that we need to do. In these patients with hyperleukocytosis, as I said, they are prone to CNS bleeds. So our threshold for platelet transfusion is very high. We try not to let their platelet count drop below 50,000. So they may need a lot of platelet transfusions in this first week of tumor lysis syndrome. And of course, we need to maintain their oxygenation, prevent overload, hyperviscosity, and hemorrhage. Next, please. Okay, so allopurinol and rasburicase are the two drugs. Allopurinol is a time-tested, very old drug. What it does is that it is an xanthine oxidase inhibitor, and when the nucleotides are released and the purines start catabolizing to form uric acid, it inhibits the xanthine oxidase. So it prevents the formation of uric acid from these purines, but it cannot handle the already formed uric acid. So when patients come with a uric acid of 15, 17, 18, allopurinol is not going to take care of that uric acid which is already formed. And that is where rasburicase, which is a urate oxidase, comes to the rescue. This rasburicase dissolves the uric acid, it metabolizes the uric acid to form allantoin, which is a highly soluble substance and can be easily excreted by the kidneys. Next, please. The rasburicase is a new drug. It's been around for about 10 to 15 years. When I was in training, we did not have rasburicase. Now it's a lifesaver. So the dose recommended is 0.2 milligram per kg given every day for 5 days. But our Indian studies have shown that just one dose of 0.1 milligram per kg can bring the uric acid drastically down from 10 to 15 to 1 and 2 in just 24 hours. Very rarely we need a second dose. It is an expensive drug, but if you can use it and you can prevent the patient from going into acute renal failure and save all the morbidity of dialysis, then definitely it is worth the cost. Next slide, please. Okay, so we are at the half an hour mark. We will switch on to the second part, which is thrombotic microangiopathies. Now, thrombotic microangiopathy, next please, are a group of conditions where there is some kind of endothelial injury because of various reasons, resulting in thrombosis in arteries and arterioles and capillaries. So because of this thrombosis in the microvasculature, there is consumption of platelets, which causes thrombocytopenia. There is damage to the red cells as they traverse these thrombosed arterioles, and this causes damage to their cell membrane, causing microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. And this thrombosed microvasculature causes organ damage to kidneys and to various organs, of which kidneys and CNS are the most important. Next, please. So thrombotic microangiopathies can be divided as primary and secondary. Primary includes the hemolytic uremic syndrome, both typical and atypical, and thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura, which is TTP. Secondary, it can occur in a variety of conditions like patients with malignant hypertension, infection, septicemia, HIV infections, variety of malignancies, autoimmune disorders, and drugs can cause secondary thrombotic microangiopathy. Next, please. Okay, so hemolytic uremic syndrome can be either typical or atypical. Both of them are characterized by this blood picture where you have fragmented RBCs called as schistocytes and thrombocytopenia. Next, please. Yeah, so typical HUS is basically caused by an infection by the Shiga toxin, which is either seen in infections with E. coli or Shigella. Typically seen in children, begins with bloody diarrhea, abdominal pain, may be associated with vomiting, fever, chills, and you get these fragmented RBCs and thrombocytopenia. These patients have renal insufficiency, raised creatinine, but it is a self-limiting disease. Most of the patients will recover completely. Less than 5 to 10%, less than 5% will go on to develop renal damage, which can later lead to end-stage renal disease. Next, please. So it is an infectious complication. It is related to the Shiga toxin, and treatment is essentially supportive. So treatment for this, antibiotics are not needed because by the time the patient presents with HUS, the infection has subsided and it is the toxin injury which is manifesting. So they need mainly supportive care with IV fluids, hydration, fluid electrolyte balance, and may need transfusions with platelets and red cells. Next one, please. So atypical HUS is far more complicated. It is not related to infection. It occurs because of a dysregulation of the complement pathway. So the immune system has the humoral pathway, which is antibodies, the cellular pathway, T cells, and then there is the complement system. So there is some dysregulation of the complement system, which causes microvascular injury and initiates the process of thrombotic microangiopathy. Next, please. Okay, so atypical HUS, apart from having damage to the kidneys, can have a variety of extrarenal manifestations in the CNS, in the peripheral vasculature. They can cause gangrene. In CVS, it can cause myocardial ischemia, cardiomyopathy, cardiac failure. In the GI, it can cause pancreatitis, mesenteric gangrene, pulmonary hemorrhage, and skeletal muscles can be affected where there may be rhabdomyolysis with release of all these things which cause can cause acute renal failure again. Next, please. Okay. And the third of this is the thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura. Now, thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura is a very, very specific and a very rare disease. Normally, what happens is that the von Willebrand factor, which is released from the endothelial cells, is present as a very large multimer, and it is broken down into smaller multiple monomers by this enzyme called as ADAMTS13. Now, a deficiency of ADAMTS13 causes large von Willebrand multimers to circulate in the blood, and these large molecules attract platelets which adhere to them to form intravascular clots and thrombosis, and leading to thrombotic microangiopathy. Next, please. Okay, so this ADAMTS deficiency can either be congenital or it can be inherited. Most common is it can be inherited, that is congenital, or it can be acquired. Most common is acquired, and it is because of antibodies which are formed to the ADAMTS protein. It is more often seen in women, and an ADAMTS level of less than 10% is diagnostic of the disease. Next, please. This is just a diagrammatic representation. Next, please. Okay, so as I said, thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura, adult onset is more common, 91%, childhood onset is only 9%. In the childhood onset, it is more likely to be congenital because of inherited ADAMTS deficiency. In the adult onset, it is usually acquired because of antibodies. Next, please. Okay, so the differential diagnosis between these three conditions can be difficult. Usually, the infection-induced typical HUS is easier to diagnose because there is history of bloody diarrhea and the severity is much less and usually seen in children. But when you have thrombocytopenia and microangiopathic hemolysis, which is documented by seeing the schistocytes on the peripheral blood, there is decreased hemoglobin, there is elevated LDH, and there is elevated unconjugated bilirubin, then you know that you're dealing with thrombotic microangiopathy. These patients may or may not have the neurological and the GI symptoms. Renal impairment is usually there. If neurological symptoms are predominant, one tends to think more of TTP. If other extrarenal manifestations are more, you tend to think more of atypical HUS. But the diagnosis comes by doing an ADAMTS13 activity. Of course, this is a sophisticated investigation. It is always a send out sent to some central lab. So reports take about 5 to 7 days at least. So the initial treatment of these patients is essentially empiric. Next, please. Yes, so we'll go to the next slide, please. Yes, so you send a pre-treatment ADAMTS13 level. But while you wait for that, you initiate treatment with plasma exchange therapy. So plasma exchange therapy or plasmapheresis is the procedure where you're basically removing the plasma which is deficient in the protein or which has the antibodies which are obstructing the normal pathways, and you replace it with normal plasma. So if plasma exchange therapy is not available, then just plasma infusions can help, but there's always a limit to how much plasma you can give a patient. You will put the patient into overload. And that is why the concept of plasma exchange therapy. So you hook on the patient to the pheresis machine, The machine takes out the plasma which is deficient or which has antibodies, and it is replaced by normal plasma or albumin and IV fluids. And this plasma exchange cycle, which goes over a couple of hours, is repeated daily. And usually by the end of 4 to 5 days, one starts seeing a response. The response is seen in terms of improvement in the platelet count, improvement in the hemoglobin, normalization of LDH. And if that happens, you can continue that. And then there is criteria when to stop. Usually patients need it for 10 to 14 days. And when the platelet count is above a certain value, LDH is stable, then you can stop. If you do not get a response to plasma exchange therapy, then you can intensify the treatment by the addition of certain immunosuppressants. Steroids, of course, can be added, but in patients who are refractory to steroids and plasma exchange therapy, rituximab comes to the rescue. Rituximab, which is anti-CD20 antibody, which we treat in treatment of lymphomas, is a very strong immunosuppressant because it destroys the B cells and it brings down the antibody level in the body. And that combined with this steroids and plasma exchange therapy can help to control in these patients with TTP. Now, if the plasma TS level comes more than 10% and you have ruled out TTP, then atypical HUS becomes a diagnosis of exclusion. It can be proven by doing certain complement studies, but again, these studies are not easily available and they are expensive. And if atypical HUS is confirmed, then treatment with eculizumab can be started. Next, please. Okay, so again, this is a diagrammatic representation that if you have adult onset acquired TTP and patient gets a complete response to the plasma exchange therapy, then they can go into durable remissions, but there's always a possibility of relapse. If patients are unresponsive, then you need to add steroids and rituximab. Or if patients respond initially and then have a recurrence, then at that point you can consider adding rituximab. Next, please. Okay, so this is just again a diagrammatic listing of the plasma exchange where you take out the plasma and you replace it with either replacement fluid containing albumin or FFP from a donor. Next, please. So treatment recommendations for atypical HUS, if they do not respond to plasma exchange therapy, then eculizumab is a new drug which is available. It is a monoclonal antibody to the C5 component of the complement pathway. And by binding to this C5, it prevents the further activation of the membrane attack complex, which is responsible for the pathology of atypical HUS. But it's an expensive drug. Again, all life-saving drugs, expensive is only a relative term. Next, please. Okay, so this is eculizumab. It is available in the brand name of Soliris, and it can be a life-saving drug in patients with atypical HUS. Next, please. Okay, now we come to the last part. I have 15 minutes left. I will try to finish it in 5 to 6 minutes. So HLH or hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis, next please, is a condition of immune dysregulation which results in a severe systemic inflammatory state, which is characterized by hectic fevers, splenomegaly, cytopenia, and end organ damage. So in the last 1 year since the onset of the pandemic, the cytokine storm phrase has become familiar to most physicians because COVID can cause cytokine storm with release of all these cytokines. But we hematologists, oncologists have been dealing with the cytokine storm for a long time in managing patients with HLH. So HLH can be either primary or secondary. In primary, it is because of some genetic defects in perforin gene or some other genes, whereas the acquired form, which is more common, can be because of infection, malignancy, or autoimmune diseases. And it stimulates the immune system and the response goes unchecked, and there is release of huge amounts of cytokines, which then cause these hectic fevers. They cause bone marrow suppression, causing cytopenias, and they can cause end organ damage. Next, please. Okay, so as I said, it is familial or it is secondary. Next, please. So malignancy triggered HLH can be seen at the time of diagnosis, especially in lymphomas, or it can be seen when patient is on chemotherapy. So when patient is on chemotherapy and we get pancytopenia, and the pancytopenia does not resolve within the expected 7 to 18, 20, 21 days, then we need to suspect HLH and we need to diagnose it, because unless it is treated promptly, it can be fatal. Next, please. Okay, so this is just data which shows that more than 50% of the times the HLH is because of malignancy when we are talking about secondary HLH, and infections contribute to about 1/4 of the cases. Next, please. Okay, so as I said, there is a trigger that causes a normal immune response, and normally when there is degranulation and the target cell, which is the infecting agent, is killed or destroyed, then the stimulus stops and there is termination of the immune response. So it is a regulated process. Now in HLH, this regulation of the immune process is lost, and because of that, there is uncontrolled cytotoxic T cell proliferation that causes uninhibited macrophage activation. And these macrophages, when they get activated, they go on a rampage. They phagocytose the own cells of the body, RBCs, platelets, other nucleated cells, and that is how the pathophysiology of HLH can be explained. Next, please. Yeah, so this is the same thing in pictorial form, that you have a trigger, cytotoxic defect. If it is there, it causes uncontrolled cell proliferation. Interferon gamma is released, which activates the macrophages, and these macrophages then release the pro-inflammatory cytokines, which cause the further damage. Next, please. Okay, so when do we suspect cytokine storm or HLH? That is when patients have hectic fevers without any apparent cause. So you are treating the underlying cause, you expect the antibiotics to cause resolution of fever, but fever persists, hectic fevers, 102, 103, daily 2-3 spikes. That is when we think of HLH. Myelosuppression, which is more prolonged than what is expected, and unexpected or progressive jaundice. Next, please. Apart from this, we also get patients who may have a rash, they may develop mucositis, there is splenomegaly, there may be coagulopathy, anemia, thrombocytopenia, and neutropenia, which is part of the myelosuppression. These patients are sick looking, toxic, there is anorexia, vomiting, weight loss, and sometimes HLH, if it affects the CNS, you can get CNS symptoms like headache, altered sensorium, and focal neurological deficits or seizures. Next, please. So when we these are the common infections. There is a big long list, but these are the common infections which can induce HLH. Viral is HIV, hepatitis, EBV, CMV, all herpes infections, parvovirus. Whereas in our country, malaria, Kala Azar are among the most common. Of course, you can have it in tuberculosis also, and you can have it in any episode of gram-negative bacterial sepsis. Next, please. Okay, so this is how it looks in the bone marrow. You have these large macrophages which have ingested either red blood cells or platelets or other granulated cells. Next, please. So there are diagnostic criteria to diagnose HLH. If there is a molecular diagnosis, there's some other family member, then you have the first criteria. But otherwise, you need 5 of these 8, which is hectic fevers for more than 7 days, significant splenomegaly, cytopenias affecting at least 2 of the 3 cell lines, hypertriglyceridemia or hypofibrinogenemia, then hemophagocytosis, which is documented on the bone marrow, absent NK cell activity, which is very difficult to get in all labs. Soluble CD25 is difficult to get, but ferritin is something which is pretty well available nowadays. This particular definition says 500, but there are other definitions which say that it should be at least 3000. But if practically you go to see, then in patients with HLH, we get ferritin levels more than 10,000. So that kind of becomes diagnostic even before the other tests are available. Next, please. Again, this is the schematic presentation. There is infection, autoimmune, insult, or cancer, which causes stimulation of T cells, but the response does not end when the stimulus is removed, and there is an exaggerated hyperinflated response. And because of that, these cytokines are released, and these macrophages infiltrate organs and cause organ damage. Next, please. So we have few minutes left. This is the HLH protocol. Once we diagnose the HLH, we immediately start them on treatment. So there are three essential components of the protocol. One is steroid, that is dexamethasone, which is very high dose, 10 mg per meter square for 2 weeks, then 5 for 2 weeks, then 2.5. So it's long period of high dose steroids. We combine with VP16, which is injection etoposide, which is a very potent immunosuppressant. And after a few weeks for maintenance, if necessary, and in patients whom it is necessary, cyclosporin is added. If we can do a diagnostic LP, and if you document that there is CSF involvement, or if that patient is clinically symptomatic and CT scan suggests CNS involvement, then intrathecal chemotherapy is introduced. Next, please. So this is a very intense protocol which has a lot of immunosuppression, but the effect is dramatic. So you give the first dose of dexamethasone, and if patient has HLH, patient becomes afebrile within 24 hours. It is like magic. It works, and it is like a therapeutic trial. Patient becomes asymptomatic, you know this is HLH, and then you have to treat with wholeheartedly. So apart from the immunosuppression, a lot of supportive care is needed: antibiotics, packed cell transfusions, platelet transfusion, FFP if they are in coagulopathy. Because of the intense immunosuppression, they need replacement IVIG. You need to do prophylaxis to prevent other infections. So acyclovir, PCV prophylaxis with cotrimoxazole, antifungal prophylaxis, high-dose steroids, so they need gastroprotection, supplementation of calcium, vitamin D. But if you start promptly and patient starts improving, it is the most satisfying patient to treat, because they respond so beautifully, and within a week they are back to normal. They want discharge 1 week after starting steroids because they say, "Doctor, I'm fine, send me home." Next, please. Okay, so I think that was the last slide. I think I've managed to take 53 minutes. We can take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just one question, Dr. Borkar.
Yes.
Can I ask the question now from the chat box? Yes.
Yes.
By Manisha Singh. She's asking, how and when palliative care can be integrated into hematologic malignancies? How and when can the integration happen in your experience?
Yes. So most of what I have said is the curative part, but as I said, not everybody responds to the curative part of therapy. And if you have leukemias in elderly patients where we know that they are not going to be candidates for intensive chemotherapy, then after the initial management of hyperleukocytosis and tumor lysis syndrome, we put them on oral metronomic therapy, or we just put them on steroids or some vincristine. But as our principles of palliative care say, that first treat the treatable. So these are acute emergencies. If we can treat them, we may not cure them of their underlying disease, but we can get the patient to be stable enough to be discharged, and then we can continue palliative care, because we know that the underlying leukemia is not going to be controlled. Similarly, for patients with TTP, if we can give a trial, if the patient does not respond to initial treatment, then we know that this is going to be fatal, and then this patient should be continued on best supportive care. But if we can treat the treatables and we can get them to respond to that, then further treatment can be decided depending upon the underlying cause.
So, Dr. Archana, I think it was a very comprehensive presentation for all the 4 conditions. So, I just want to tell all the palliative medicine people, those who are treating patients, these are acute emergencies, and this can be treated very well. And this was the purpose of this lecture, that it should come from Dr. Anupama, that how to handle these emergencies. It is not necessary if patient has present with some kind of a tumor lysis syndrome or thrombocytopenic purpura, that this patient is dying. So they have a life, but again, you have a very good knowledge and attitude that you can manage these patients very well with the acute emergency, and simultaneously you will start prognosticating and by giving honest information about the disease and the realistic hope of the long-term treatment. So this is the purpose. I want to tell one more answer. I want to give one more answer, from the last lecture that one or two doctors, they have asked that how all these lectures will help us in treating our patient at hospice. So I just want to tell you that this is important even in the hospice. If you are a doctor and a nurse, and if you are treating these patients, you should have a basic understanding about the diseases and basic understanding about the medication which can do miracle in their life besides your own medication which you use in palliative medicine. So it is not, I'm not telling that you will start treating these patients, but at least you will have an idea that you will start taking help from the oncologist if their patients are coming or presenting in hospice, that this patient, something can be done better beyond pain management and symptom management. So this was the purpose, this is the purpose of all these lectures. And Dr. Anupama, thank you very much for presenting it so well. I know that all 4 conditions we have kept in one lecture, but this much only is required by right now for all palliative care physicians of the country. And thanks a lot. And we will all see you next week on Monday before 6:30. Any other comments, Arun? If you have, please, we have 3 more minutes.
No.
Huh? No. So
No more
thank you.
comments. No more comments.
No more comments. So thank you, Dr. Anupama. Even I have learned so well with the sequence wise that how to handle all these situations systematically. So it was a good presentation and good overview of all these conditions. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.